We begin today with the government's big moves in education. Legislation to reintroduce charter schools in New Zealand passed its final reading this week, with the first charter schools set to be up and running at the start of next year. Meanwhile, the government says parents could face fines and even prosecution under a new program to tackle chronic absences and truancy. I sat down with Associate Education Minister David Seymour and asked if the new STAR attendance program will increase schools' workloads.
If you're talking about attendance, then it is going to put an impost on schools. All schools will have to have an attendance plan, but we're also really mindful that they're busy. That's why we're going to not require it until the start of 2026, so there's a good run-in. And we're also going to be really clear that this is the template of what we think the best options are for an attendance plan, and that's based on what I'm doing at the moment, which is hui or meetings with people that are very good at it. I've already sat down with youth aid police officers, attendance officers, deputy principals, deans up and down the country in Christchurch, Palmerston North, Auckland, to hear, well, what are the things that you think work? We're going to put that into a draft plan and say, you've got to have a plan. You might want to take some options from this menu.
Here's the thing though, you give them the framework, the schools are the ones who actually have to do this stuff, right? Will you be providing them any additional resources when they go into those 2026 changes?
Well, that remains to be seen. It's part of a budget process. At the moment, we budget about $47 million a year for attendance services, and that gives you roughly about 300 people, but they're chasing around. Just to give you an idea of the scale of the problem, you know, you've got 8 to 10% of students in any given term who are chronically absent, so that's something like 60 to 80,000 students that they're trying to chase around. Now, that's a
Illness plays a big part in that.
Chronically absent means that you're missing more than 3 weeks in a 10-week term. So if there are children that are ill for 3 weeks, then my heart goes out to them and we sympathise, but I don't think that explains 60 to 80,000.
But it might make up some of the absence that then applies to the chronically absent title, right?
It certainly could,
yeah.
But at the same time, if you go back 10 years, the same figure was only about 4%. So
I don't think anyone's disputing that there's a problem.
So either there's been a major shift in illness, and if that's true, we should really look at that. But what appears to have happened is that right across society, education has become a lower priority on the totem pole. And what the government is really trying to do with our various initiatives is say, look, you know, up to you ultimately, but at the end of the day, the success of our society and the people in it is going to depend on how much knowledge we pass from one generation to the next. And the most efficient way to do that is to be regularly attending school.
What's to stop a parent from just blaming illness?
A parent certainly could do that, and a lot of this is about, you know, what you might call soft power, or, you know, selling it to people. So better information about what really is illness and when you sometimes can go, because we were told for several years that, you know, health comes above all else. It's often true, but not always. So we publish that guidance.
I mean, if you think about a parent though who's got a kid who's sitting around at home playing video games all day at the moment, and the parent, for whatever reason, isn't getting that kid to go to school. If the school then calls the parent and says, "Why is David or Jack not in school today?" there's nothing to stop the parent saying, "Oh, he's sick."
They certainly can, but I mean, I think you've got to be a bit cautious about stereotyping. These situations are so complicated from what I've heard, talking to people in the last few months. So, for example, I talked to a youth aid police officer recently who has a collection, he tells me, of Xboxes and PlayStations that he's confiscated off children out of their homes. And I said, hang on, aren't you supposed to stop burglary? And he said, well, actually, the parents asked me to take them because the parents don't feel that the parents want them to go to school. They don't feel they have the authority within their own home. They're literally asking him to play the bad cop. So, you know, what we're doing here with the stepped attendance response scheme is we're saying the parents have obligations, the students have obligations, the school has obligations, and we as government and other government departments such as Oranga Tamariki and the police also have obligations. As a child's attendance gets worse, if it goes outside that 90% zone, then there's a stepped response at each stage. Yeah,
it just seems like a very easy workaround for parents who perhaps aren't playing their role in this equation, just to say, yeah, the kid's sick. And if you look at NCEA, for example, if a child misses an NCEA exam, they are required to provide a doctor's certificate. Is that the sort of thing that you would expect for chronic absences?
Yeah, well, if you're away for 5 days, you're supposed to provide a doctor's certificate.
But do people do that?
Yeah, they do. I mean, and once again, I mean, it's so easy to stereotype. I've had GPs complain to me that the schools are being too fastidious and they're getting blocked up with people trying to get medical certificates because they're worried about being in trouble with the school. So, you know, there are people who really, really want to go but have some barrier. There are people that have everything laid on for them and don't have the right attitude. And what we're trying to do, rather than one size fits all, is empower each community with a framework of here's the roles and responsibilities of each person. Because if we're going to get from 56% that we, or sorry, 53% that we reported for term 2 just yesterday, or a few days ago, sorry, then get that up to 80%. That is a mammoth effort, and everyone has a role to play in it.
Do parents who take their kids on holiday during term time deserve to be punished?
I think if it's repeated, then yes. I mean, you can imagine a scenario where a family saves up for a long time. They say we're going to go to Japan and we're actually going to learn more doing that in 3 weeks than we might have if we'd stayed at school for an extra week. Now, I've had someone give me that literal example, and you sort of say, well, fair enough. But what's interesting, in that scenario, if they went to school every other day during the term, they'd still just make the 90%. So I don't think that, it's the right thing if you're going to Fiji and you want to get, some money off your fare to put school down the rankings of your priorities for that reason. But ultimately, parents are the parents of the children. They do have choices. We're just trying to create a framework where people make good choices.
Charter schools. The acting ACT Party president, former candidate Catherine Isaac, has been appointed this week to the Charter Schools Authorisation Board. Is that a paid position?
Yes, it is.
How much?
It's under a fees framework. I think it's around $600 per full day. So there's a system that's set out by Cabinet for the amount of money that you get if you're appointed to a position.
It's a bit cosy, isn't it? The acting ACT Party president?
If that was the reason that she was appointed, then I would be completely opposed to it. But you've got to remember that Catherine Isaac was in charge of the Charter Schools Authorisation Board last time round. She probably knows more about this policy and the application process and the assessment of charter schools in New Zealand than anyone else alive. So the dilemma I faced was, okay, yep, someone like you is going to say, oh, isn't she involved with ACT? Isn't she going to get a day rate that everyone else in these positions gets, by the way? So maybe I should not put her on there and actually lose the knowledge that she has from the policy. I decided in the end it was actually the right policy choice to put her on there.
Wouldn't it make it easier then, if that position is so important, for her to step down as the acting party president?
Well, if it was going to prevent her from doing the job in an effective way, then you'd want to consider
that. It's about perceptions of neutrality, isn't it?
Well, it is, but ultimately, I can explain it to you pretty clearly here. People can see that she is a person who has genuine value for the role, that she's been put through the same process, gone through Cabinet, anything that's been paid by the same fees framework that Cabinet sets for people in that position. So then the challenge for people who have that perception is, okay, yes, she could step down from the other role, but how would that improve education in New Zealand?
When was it's again about perceptions of neutrality, and if you want to have buy-in so that this endures through different political cycles, and that's going to be absolutely vital when it comes to charter schools. We'll get onto that in a second.
I think you've just accepted it's an irrational objection.
It's about the perception of reality. I haven't accepted that. All I've accepted is that.
But the reason you're talking about perception is there's nothing real there, so you're talking about perception.
When was the last time that a party president was appointed by a government that included that party to a paid public role?
Well, I'm not here for Trivial Pursuit, but I mean, I think we can say the appointment.
Can you give me any examples?
I don't think it's relevant. Like I say, it's not Trivial Pursuit, Jack. It's actually, is she going to do the job well?
Can't do any examples.
Is she the best person?
Well, it's whether or not, in the eyes of critics, that she has sufficient political neutrality for the role, and whether or not stepping down from that party president role would be appropriate given the circumstances. Now, you've received 78 applications for charter schools.
That's right.
So on day one of term 1 next year, how many charter schools will be operating?
There could well be up to 15. It depends, first of all, on whether there are 15 that the Authorisation Board decides to put through on the first day. And second of all, if the ones that they say are good enough out of that 78 to start straight away, are they ready to start? And I'd always say to people, look, it's nice to be fast, but it's more important to get it right. So it could be up to 15 that have been funded as new schools. I don't think that there will be any state schools that will convert because that whole conversion process is quite complex and quite
You mean
new.
for term 1 next year, but you
Yeah.
do expect that will happen in the future?
I do expect it will happen in the future.
Right.
I think it's a very appealing proposition for someone running a state school to become a charter, but it is quite a complex and novel transition to make.
When do you think the first state school transition will be completed and we'll see a state school become a charter school?
I wouldn't be surprised if you saw that in the first day of term in 2026.
Right.
It means that we have time to take people through the process of what it means to convert, consult the community, because ultimately, this is only going to happen if the community really wants it to happen. The authorisation board, one of the main things they're going to be looking for is, do the people around your school community want to see it happen? So you've got to do that consultation. You've got to have a plan. You've got to work out what you do with the property. So there's quite a bit to work through.
So the legislation passed this week includes a provision that would mean a minister could direct a school to convert into a charter school. Under what circumstances might a minister use that?
Well, you look at schools at the moment where they're not going very well. What we tend to do is put in a statutory or commission manager. Often they'll manage the school for a period of time. Often it will be, a retired principal, and then they try and restart it with a board of trustees. And sometimes that cycle can actually happen multiple times. So all we've done is create the possibility that for schools that are really in a lot of difficulty, where the ministry is already having to intervene, another option might be to say, well, actually, there's a group of people over here who are willing to enter into a contract that think that they can use the flexibility of the charter school model, more flexible employment, more flexible around curriculum, more flexible around how they use the funds they get, that they might be able to do something a bit special here. And we've just created, we're not saying that's going to happen, but the law has created the legal possibility.
Because that didn't exist under the previous iteration of charter schools, right?
No,
that provision didn't exist.
No, and there's two types of charters. So there's those that are a brand new proposition, and all of them last time were that type. Then there's a school that currently is a state or integrated school where the school community chooses to change.
Yeah, right. How far would you like to see this model go? How many charter schools do you think there could be in New Zealand?
Well, in the UK, they started in about 2012, and today, 12 years later, 80% of secondary schools are free schools and academies, or their version of charter schools. So it's quite possible that we could be back here in a decade, or hopefully I will have been put out to political pasture, but in a decade's time you'll be interviewing someone, I'm sure, and looking exactly the same.
I think the future for the media is even bleaker than that for politicians.
Well, yeah, okay. Well, look, let's not argue about who's going to last the longest here. But at any event, I'm sure democracy has a bright future.
80%.
Yep. Well, that's what happens in the UK.
But do you think that's realistic in New Zealand? 80% of secondary schools, for example.
Well, I think anything the Brits can do, we can do.
Yeah. Do you think that's a good model?
I actually do, and I think if you look at what's happened in the UK, so many of the schools that Ofsted, which is their ERO, had assessed were really underperforming. They converted, and on average, they're now doing better.
So the Select Committee report suggested that the legislation as it stands might breach some of our trade agreements by not allowing teachers at charter schools to collectively bargain across multiple schools. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, it's the easiest thing in the world to claim and impossible to disprove. Yes, somebody under some international convention could take a run at us. I don't think they will, for the very simple reason that we're not in any way disadvantaging anyone else by having better education in New Zealand. So if it was like we had a way to, I don't know, produce milk solids more cheaply, there might be people around the world who want to take a crack at us because they see that as giving us an unfair advantage over them. I don't really see that in education.
Except that teacher unions have real strength around the world, right? This isn't just a phenomenon in New Zealand. And is it not feasible that another jurisdiction where teacher unions are really strong might say, you know what, we don't want to see a UK or New Zealand style model introduced here, so we're actually going to take a crack at the New Zealand model?
And they could well do that for ideological reasons, but that would require the government of their country to do it. And I just also make the point that, when Labor put through the so-called fair pay agreements, they had a scathing negative opinion from the International Labour Organisation, and Labor said, oh, well, this is important to New Zealand, we carry on doing it. I would argue that getting some more flexibility to get children to school engaged in learning is so important to New Zealand that we should be prepared to hear criticism from our friends around the world, but I actually suspect we won't.
School lunches. Documents released with the budget found the free school lunch program was super effective. Quote, initial findings indicate the program is having a profound impact on the well-being of learners. Profound. You then cut $107 million in funding from the scheme. What will your cuts mean for the impact of that program?
So a couple of things. First of all, if you want to get down to really robust evidence, like really statistically, valid comparisons of schools that have them and schools that don't have them, and do more children come to school, the ministry did 5 different studies. One of them found that there may be a 1.6% improvement in children coming to school at a school that has the healthy school lunch program.
So that standard proof study found it was associated with improved attendance for some kids, which was equivalent to 3 days annually, which is substantial.
Well, if there's 200 days a year, then 1.6% is 3 days, isn't it? So
yeah.
I agree with that. 1.6% is what they found. Now, all I'd say to you is that if they really have, as you said, profound increases in well-being...
That's what your advice said, not what I said.
Well, no, it's not my advice, it's advice, I think.
Advice provided to you as the Associate Education Minister?
I get all sorts of advice.
It's a profound impact on the well-being of learners.
So, I mean, you got to sort of square the circle, right? Like, some people say it's a profound impact, but it didn't even get a 2% increase in actually coming to school. If it was something was profoundly...
see, it didn't say profound impact on attendance, it said profound impact on the well-being of learners.
No, I understand what you're saying, but my point is...
It's a broader impact, isn't it?
My point is that if something was profoundly improving your well-being, wouldn't you make more than a 2% effort to get it?
Well, my question is, what impact will your cuts to that funding have on the...
Possibly it's going to make it even better. I'm cautious about how I comment on this right now because as we speak, our excellent people on the expert advisory group are in negotiations with the providers, so I don't want to compromise their position. But all I'll say is that there's been a lot of interest. It's very competitive. It's amazing what you can do. I was even amazed at the quality of the offerings from the providers. And put it this way, we may well end up doing this at $3 a student. In fact, I'm pretty confident we will. I suspect we might actually get better product out of it. And previously, Labor were doing it at $8.61. Now, if they had introduced the model we're introducing 5 years ago, they could have saved nearly $1 billion and got the same result.
It wasn't always $8.61, just to be clear. It was between just over $6 and $8.61.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, the point is we're saving $3 to $5 a day.
Sure, but so back to that question, though, because I think you talked about the tendering process. Is there a risk that you will get worse outcomes by cutting funding?
Well, I think there was already a wide variety of outcomes, but what we're seeing in the
across the board, is there a risk?
Well, there's always a risk until you sign the contract and see the first lunch sign up.
So what is that risk? Talk to us about that risk.
Well, the risk is that people won't like the quality that they get. I mean, that is a risk. I'd be lying if I said that we can absolutely guarantee what's going to show up at the end of a tendering process, but every indication is that we can do as well or better with less money by being smarter. That's what every business, firm, farm, family in this country has had to do for the last 3 years. Now we've got a government that's doing it because, sorry to say, the government's broke.
Will it mean hot food?
It will.
So in every school that was being provided hot lunches, will they get the same number of hot lunches?
Look, I'm not going to, like I say, they're in negotiation, so I don't want to go into, promising exactly
I've been
what the
through those tender documents, though, and the example meals that were given were predominantly hot meals, right? Are they heat and eat meals?
Well, again, if I start making promises, then that compromises our negotiators. So I'm not trying to be difficult, but I do genuinely have to respect their space to do their job.
Let me ask this then. If you were to accept a tender that involved heat and eat meals, will you provide schools with the necessary equipment to heat those meals?
So there's going to be probably several models used, and in some models there'll be more on-school preparation than other schools. And again, this is just about listening to people. There's some schools who say, look, we've got nothing to do with it, get the food to the children and let us get on with educating and teaching. Fully respect that. There's others who say actually being actively involved in the preparation of the food has been of value, of educational value. And I've
broader well-being thing, right?
Well, I've visited schools where they've got involved in trying to create a circular economy with zero waste, and they're doing their logistics, and it's all quite impressive what some of the students are doing. So there'll be some schools more at that end of the spectrum. There'll be others more at the this is something we need to get done so we get back to the other stuff we do. There will be accommodation for both ends of that.
Right, and when you say accommodation, like if there was a school with 1,500 kids that needed to heat 1,500 burritos at lunchtime, are you going to give them the microwave so that they can do it?
Well, that again, That will depend on exactly what we end up tendering, and it will end up on which end of that spectrum their model is.
But if that is required, that is a provision that the government will meet rather than the schools themselves.
I wouldn't say that we definitely won't, but I'm also not going to go out and promise we will. And I know this is frustrating, but we are literally.
We'll move on.
Money is in the balance right now,
I know the tender process is underway at the moment. As the new Minister for Regulation, what have you learnt about setting up that ministry and about regulation that you didn't previously appreciate?
I didn't appreciate how undervalued regulation has been as a thing across government. I don't think that we've done very well at regulatory impact analysis. I knew that, but we really haven't had a crack team that's there. So what's happened is we've set this thing up. We've had a lot of people in temp. Now we've had, as of last week, about 20 permanent positions actually appointed. So it's taken quite a while to get together a group of people who want to take regulation really seriously, but we are doing that, and I'm increasingly, actually every week, I'm more impressed with what Grania Moss and her team are achieving.
So the average salary across the public service is $97,000 a year. The average salary at your Ministry of Regulation is $150,000 a year. So why do staff at that ministry get paid so much more than staff of other ministries?
With respect, that's untrue, or at the very least, very misleading. We're starting a new agency. Generally, you hire the management first and then employ more people under them. So given, as I say...
it's going to be more than the 97 staff at the moment?
No, it will have 91.
91?
At the moment, it has a combination of temps, secondees from other departments, and permanent staff. At this point, we've only got about 20 permanent positions filled, and they tend to be the more senior ones first. So if you just take the average of that, you get a high figure, sure, but that's incredibly misleading. And I note...
so will it be comparable to other ministries once those permanent roles are filled?
It'll be comparable to other ministries that have a similar role. So if you look at the Treasury, for example, the Treasury is mostly economists and policy analysts, and those people tend to be paid more. If you look at, say, corrections, they've got a large number of prison guards, very important role, but they tend to be on lower salaries than experts in economic policy, say. So it will certainly be completely comparable to other departments that do similar work, and you've got to be careful quoting those figures, because if you look carefully in the back page of the Dominion Post, you'll find that the journalist who gave you that figure had to issue a correction.
Oh no! I just looked at information available from the public service as to which ministries are how much ministries pay their staff,
and got a misleading outcome. So.
Well, no, I mean I just access publicly available information. So there are those
which
two.
Didn't say what you thought is the point. No one's saying that the information isn't there. It's about what it means, and do you understand what it means?
Yeah, well, we've given you an opportunity to explain it.
Thank you.
There are two regulatory reviews that have been underway through the ministry. So one goes into ECE, into early childhood education. The other goes into agriculture and horticultural products. That's going to be finished or concluded first. So what is the likely outcome once that's done? What's going to happen?
Basically, there's going to be a collation of what everyone's told us. There's been, I think, over 2,000 people have engaged with it earlier. I mean, we've actually had to extend the time of reporting back because there's been so much interest. We've had really substantial, dozens.
This is for ECE though, right?
Yeah.
So for Ag and Hort, which is going to be done, agriculture and horticultural products, which is going to be done sooner, concluded sooner. Like, what will happen when that's concluded?
So at this point, it's not clear what the final results will be, but I'll give you some examples of what they might be. There's a structure where you've got partly MPI and partly EPA, who are the regulator. Is that the right structure? Should there be two regulators, or should there be a more seamless experience for people trying to get stuff approved to bring into New Zealand? At the moment, there's quite long checklist and maybe not enough consideration of, well, if something's legal in Australia, maybe there aren't that big of differences here because they're basically in the same global food market. Sure, there's some environmental differences with New Zealand, but we can maybe be a bit more reliant on what's allowed overseas, similar to what we're doing with human medicines. So you might see something like that. You might see more timelines. You might see perhaps more guidance or updates of the toxicology models, which are currently used to model whether something is too toxic to use in New Zealand. It turns out those are very out of date, and therefore they're requiring more data from the people who just want to sell their products to New Zealand farmers and horticulturalists. So I just give you three examples of the kinds of changes that might be proposed, but at the end of it, will be able to say, look, if you're someone that wants to use the latest products for making farming efficient and environmentally friendly in New Zealand, then it's going to be quicker to get stuff to market. There'll be more affordable stuff on the shelves, and we'll be able to boost productivity in the New Zealand agricultural sector, which is what it's really all about.
So we're going to talk about the actual substance of the Treaty Principles Bill once that bill is finally introduced. I've just got a few questions about the process so far. So during the election campaign, you said a binding referendum on the Treaty Principles would be a bottom line in exchange for your party's support in government, an absolute top priority. And yet here we are, a year on, and the only way that we will have a binding referendum is if National agrees to pass your law, which the Prime Minister says explicitly and in the plainest language he will not support. So why did you capitulate on that bottom line?
Well, they also said that there was no way that they'd have any of it. I guess what you've found is that you've got two parties, and I think Chris has said the same thing. Neither side's particularly happy with it because no one got everything they wanted. But critically, what we have allowed is...
This is your number one priority during the campaign. All of those people who supported ACT did so knowing that your absolute top priority was the bottom line was a binding referendum. And here we are, you're in government, and we don't have one.
Well, what we do have is a bill that is finally going to democratise what the treaty principles mean, because for a long time, unless you're a judge or on the Waitangi Tribunal or an academic or a public servant, you don't get much say on what our founding document means. For the first time, we're going to democratise the debate on that. Now, is that as far as I'd like to go? No. Has it significantly changed the debate? Yes, and you can see that because of the reaction you're getting from all these people who don't want the great unwashed to be able to have a say about our constitutional future.
We'll talk about the process once the bill is introduced. What is the risk if we don't go through this process and have this debate?
I think the risk is that we increasingly adopt a version of the treaty which says it's a partnership between races. That's what the Court of Appeal said. It's what the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern repeated 35 years later. And as a result, we increasingly see ourselves not as human beings and New Zealanders with challenges and choices and problems to solve and overcome, and as we go through our lives, we see each other as Maori or non-Maori. And once you start telling people to think of each other in racial terms, the danger is people will start to actually do it. I feel to some extent they have, and our country's become more divided. I think it's important that we actually say, no, everyone's allowed to have a discussion about this. It's not going to be all terrible. Actually, New Zealanders can have a discussion about our constitutional future. We're going to have that discussion. Will it go as far as we'd like? Possibly not. On the other hand, as I've said...
You accept that now?
Well, it's possible that they won't, but I also just make the point that I think that this is going to be a lot more positive and uplifting than people believe. And once you see where it gets to, people say, we actually can have a say in our constitutional future. It might end up being a more popular idea than some people expect.
How much is it going to cost?
Well, it's actually going to cost nothing because it's using up parliamentary resources in Parliament.
Well, there's an opportunity cost right there.
Well, Parliament, as far as I know, was planning to be open and debating bills all of next year anyway. So the cost is debating some other piece of legislation that it could have otherwise been doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. So then the question
That's a cost.
Yep. So then the question is, do you think that it's worthwhile having a serious democratic debate about what the principles of our founding document are? I believe it is worthwhile.
Well, the question is really, is there any point in going through a 6-month select committee process when the Prime Minister says he won't be supporting this through to the next reading?
Well, first of all, as I've said, let's see what the result is in the end. But second of all...
Can you point to any public comment that Christopher Luxon has made since the election in which he has suggested they will support this through to the second reading?
Well, that's your standard. My standard is let's wait until we've seen the legislation. Let's wait until people have had a chance to
I can give you plenty of
react to
examples the other way. ACT would have liked to have had a full public referendum after the select committee process and law going through Parliament. That's not going to happen, Christopher Luxon. We won't be supporting it, Christopher Luxon. The National Party position is we will not be supporting that bill, Christopher Luxon. Give me an example of him saying that he might support it through the second reading.
And that's your standard. We can all quote him. However, the question is, how will people feel once we've seen the legislation, once the public have had a chance to submit and have their say on it, once people have decided what they really think about it? My challenge is let's wait and keep an open mind.
The question is, what's the point? Would you agree that it would be wasteful for a government to introduce a bill and go through that full 6-month select committee process for something the leader says has no chance of passing?
Well, the leader of another party says, but I just give you the example.
The leader of that government?
well, actually, I'm not sure he said that as the leader of the National Party.
I can read those quotes again. Okay, but he's, one and the same in this circumstance.
Well, no.
Right? As the leader of the National Party who happens to be Prime Minister, if the National Party isn't going to support it, it isn't going through the second reading.
Well, I agree that that's their current position.
So would that be wasteful?
No, not at all. And I'll give you this example. In 1995, Michael Laws brought a right to die bill to Parliament. It got shot down in flames. It went down by 2 votes to 1. However, it started a debate. 8 years later, Peter Brown brought another bill, which lost by only 2 votes. It was another 16 years until my end-of-life choice bill passed by 10 votes. So if you were to say, was it a waste of time for Michael Laws to bring that bill in 1995? I would say no, it was essential.
Do you think even if this doesn't pass this time round, it will help or hurt ACT's support?
Look, what helps ACT support is that we are actually brave. We're prepared to take on issues that other people won't do.
So that's not my
and
question,
do it in
though.
a constructive and conciliatory way.
So do you think if this doesn't pass, that ACT will still enjoy a boost in the polls, that it'll increase your support?
Well, like I say, and I've got to be fair both ways. I said, other people say they're going to vote for it or not vote for it. I say, let's wait and see how the public react. I expect that reaction will be positive, and actually it probably will help ACT politically, but that's a secondary concern. The real concern is I don't want to live in a country where we're told that we're a partnership between races. I want to live in a country where we have ngā tikanga katoa rite tahi, the same rights and duties, just like the treaty
I say,
says.
we will have an opportunity to debate the substance once the bill's introduced. But that's a critical point, right? You're introducing this, despite it not meeting your bottom lines during the campaign, and you acknowledge that it's likely to boost ACT's party support. Given you are so determined to cut wastage, you will literally cut back funding for hot meals for poor kids. Why should anyone believe that spending all of this resource on a bill that has no chance of passing this time round is anything more than a cynical move to use the machinery of government for your own party's ends?
Well, let's just unpack that Jack Tame classic. First of all, I think we're going to get better meals. We're going to save money. If Labor had done that, they could have saved $1 billion over the last 5 years. But hey,
if you're so determined to cut down on wastage, and you will introduce a bill that has no chance of passing.
Second of all, as we've already established, there is no cost to this. Parliament's going to be open next year anyway. The cost is some other piece of legislation. I actually do think that this is a worthwhile debate. And finally, as I've given you with the example of euthanasia, sometimes you actually have to start a debate. And the reason we're getting so much angry reaction to this simple idea is there are too many people who think the great unwashed don't deserve a say about their constitutional future. Well, I think our universal humanity trumps any of our ancestry or our ethnic background, and it's time to celebrate what unites us rather than what divides.
Obviously, come November, if that's when the bill is introduced, we will return to this issue. We're waiting on an official decision about the future of the Cook Strait ferries. What's your position?
Well, my position is that I'm a member of Cabinet and I'll participate in the discussions. The only thing I would say is that it's very important that we recognise every dollar we spend on one thing, we can't spend on another. And that goes for anything. If we spend money on ferries, then think about schools, classrooms, hospitals, doctors' surgeries and so on. If we think, well, not that doctors' surgeries are government-owned.
There's an opportunity cost, just as there is with legislating.
Yeah, but the opportunity cost in this case is dollars rather than parliamentary time to debate another piece of legislation. Now, when it comes to the decision, we ought to keep an open mind about are we absolutely certain that what we do ensures that the money we put forward on behalf of the taxpayer is going to the absolute best use. Because I talk to people in property development and they say we can't get consent to build more homes for the next generation.
Sorry, back to the ferries
because we don't have the pumping stations.
I get the broader point, but so ferries, do you think there is a good argument to have rail on ferries? Do you think that represents good value for money?
I think that's one of the things that you've got to consider, and you've seen the arguments in the press this week.
And so what's your position on that?
Well, again, I'm participating in a discussion in good faith based on the evidence. So I'm happy to tell you, what sort of things you'd want to consider, but I'm not going to, bring a discussion amongst ministers and cabinet out into the public domain. That's a betrayal of my colleagues. Obviously, you'd want to think about, well, if you can't get carriages across Cook Strait, or locomotives across Cook Strait, then you kind of have two separate railways. Is that viable? Is it necessary to have rail on the South Island? Well, during Kaikoura, we didn't have it for a couple of years, and things seemed to carry on largely okay. We lost the road as well at the same time, and yet, while it was obviously very bad, and I remember having to drive down the middle of the island a couple of times myself, that showed that sometimes things are more resilient than they think. So you weigh that up, and that's the nature of the discussions we're having.
Finally, New Zealand voted in support of a UN resolution that affirmed the International Court of Justice's opinion that Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territories is unlawful. To be clear, did you disagree with that opinion?
Well, no, I was never asked about it. Didn't have the opportunity to give feedback on it. But I would just make the point that in the Middle East you've got quite an evil empire emanating out of Iran. Certainly I'm a person who represents a lot of people who have come from Iran to escape that on the Epsom electorate. I've taken on the Irani ambassador from time to time on that exact issue, and now we've got them operating a series of proxy wars against a democratic state. Once you look at it that way, then all of a sudden you have to be a bit more sober about, okay, if Israel's borders were to be brought back like that, would they be viable? And I don't know that New Zealand should be taking a different position from our traditional allies, our Five Eyes partners, who all either opposed the motion or abstained. So I think that there's a reasonable case to debate that. The point I've made about it is that actually our Foreign Minister made the decision. I support him as I support all of our government's ministers. That's what being on the team means. But I've also said, I hope in the future there'll be more open debate about this, because it's pretty important.